I need patience, Lord.
I need patience, Lord.
I need patience, Lord.
I need patience, Lord.
To bear the burdens of this world. I need patience, Lord.
I need patience, Lord. Please keep me strong through the trials. Help me hold on to hope through all the storms. Patience, Lord. I need patience, Lord. Please help me to endure.
I need patience, Lord.
I need patience, Lord.
I need patience, Lord.
I need patience, Lord.
To bear the burdens of this world. I need patience, Lord.
I need patience, Lord. Please keep me strong through the trials. Help me hold on to hope through all the storms. Patience, Lord. I need patience, Lord. Please help me to endure.
I'm here today to talk with you about the kingdom of heaven, and specifically a few parables that deal with patience from Matthew chapter 13. Here I am again talking about patience. Now, I don't know if it kind of maybe seems to you like I've just recently talked about patience, or maybe it's been a little while, but patience does tend to be one of these topics that I bring up every so often. And it's not so much that it's because, oh, I've got, just a handful of passages and those are all that I really preach from. No, the reason why patience shows up is because there's so many passages in the Bible that talk about patience and talk about the need for patience. It's almost as if God knew that we were going to be struggling with patience and perhaps waiting on His own time. Because so many times He works on His time schedule, not necessarily our time schedule. If you want examples of that, look in Hebrews chapter 11, this wonderful chapter of great men and women of faith. And so many of those people, they lived and they died and they still didn't even see what God had promised to them. But here we are going to look at these parables that teach us in maybe some different ways than what we would typically look at. They teach us patience. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a warning before I get into these parables right here. As far as my personal experiences, what we're going to be looking at, I don't have a whole lot to go off of, but I think that we can still get the point even if we haven't necessarily experienced these exact things. That will make a little bit more sense as we look at these parables, so let's look at them together. The first parable comes to us from Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. And this has to do with a man who is sowing seed in a field. Now, really, myself, I don't have too much experience with doing that. I've maybe planted just like a little bit in a little garden, but nothing quite like what's described right here. But I believe we can still get it. Matthew chapter 13, verses 24 through 30. Let's look at it together. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "An enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let them grow together until the harvest. And at that time I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned. Then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." Now, this is one of these parables that I actually really do like, and I think there's a lot that it can teach us. However, if you find yourself being a little bit confused as to, well, what is he talking about, and what does he mean about this seed and this field and these weeds, and what is he getting at right here? If you seem confused at this point, the disciples were confused, and they actually asked him about it later. And we are going to take a look at that in a little bit, but before we do, we're going to look at the two other parables that follow this. But the main thing that we see from this parable is there is this man, and he sows this good seed in his field. An enemy does come and sow something that's not that good seed. And they grow both together. And in the wisdom of the owner of this property here, the owner of the field, he says to let them grow together for a while. Now that, to us at first you might think, well, of course you just want to weed out the garden, right? Well, sometimes if you aren't careful, when you weed out the garden and you get the weeds out from it, you also mess up the good things. Now, I've done that before. If ever I've tried to kind of, get the weeds or the plants that were maybe in there, I've ended up destroying some of the good plants. But here in this passage, you're talking about not just like a small garden, not just like a plant or two, but you're talking about this whole field. Likely, this person's livelihood is all wrapped up in this field. Well, there's a lot that's going on, but for starters, we see that this does require some patience. It requires patience on the part because these servants, they look at it and they're like, okay, do you want us to do something about it immediately? Sometimes that's how we are with God, right? We want to do something immediately. And sometimes people might even look at the world around us and they might say, why is God not doing something about the evil in this world, about the bad things that are in the world in which we see? Well, for right now, let's just have patience and let's combine this parable with the two that follow it as well. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 31 through 35, we see two more parables. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet when it grows, it is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. He told them still another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed into about 60 pounds of flour until it worked all through the dough. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowds in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. So as you look at these parables, we've been introduced to three. We've got this one about the good and the bad seed, this mustard seed, and yeast. What's the common ground here? What do we have that is the same in these three parables? Well, as I've mentioned before, all of them do deal with patience of some sort. The first parable, of course, the servants want to act instantly, but the owner, he says, let's wait for the right time. Here in this mustard seed, you look at it, it's a small, small seed. Now, I've never really planted a mustard seed, and I don't know all that much about, the bush or the tree that grows from it, but we see that the concept is it's something so small. And in fact, the growth of something so small is kind of hard to see. In order for you to see it, it takes time and it takes, somewhat a bit of effort as well. But we see that patience is required. We also see in verse 33 that another parable that is introduced is this one about yeast. Now, I have a little bit more experience in this because, my wife, she actually does like to make some bread every once in a while, the old-fashioned way, putting the yeast in it, letting it rise and stuff. And I know it takes a lot longer to get bread from there. Now, it tastes great, but it takes a long time. And that yeast, it's not something that just instantly happens. It's something that has to mix throughout the whole batch of dough, and then it's got to start working. It requires patience to make bread with this yeast. It requires patience to see a mustard seed produce anything worthwhile. And it takes some patience whenever you look out at a field and you see there's this good and the bad seed mixed. What do we do about all this? Well, I want to share with you a quotation that I found from a commentary. It's a man by the name of, many times he goes by N.T. Wright, or his name is Tom Wright. And he comments on these parables, and this is what he says. He says, we wait with patience, not like people in a dark room wondering if anyone will ever come with a lighted candle, but like people in early morning who know that the sun has arisen, and we are now waiting for the full brightness of midday. So this was in his commentary. It's actually, he's got a whole series over the entire New Testament. This one is found in the Matthew for Everyone, the part that deals with these parables right here. But he wrote about this, and I like that idea of that, about this patience. It's not like we're people who are waiting in a dark room and we're just, oh, can't wait till somebody comes with this candle. No, no, no. It's more so like people in the early morning. The sun has already risen, and you know that just because the sun has risen, yes, you start to see the light, but the light doesn't really fully come until later. And that there's an interesting thing whenever you see the sunrise and you see the brightness come all about it. But it's not until later on, whenever the sun is fully out there, that you really get the brightness, you really get the heat, and you get everything that the sun brings to us. That is a wonderful image, I believe, of what these parables are talking about. It's a wonderful image about this patience that is required. That patience like in the early morning. We've already seen the sun arise. And yes, this is the sun like the physical one, but we also know that spiritually speaking, the Son of God, he rose up from the dead. And we see that that starts in something new. Even though right now we don't always see it and we still see a bit of darkness, we still see the beginning. We see the dawn of something new that God is doing in our world. This is something he started 2,000 years ago, and he is still actively involved in to this very day. I want to share another thing. I know I oftentimes don't really share quotations from different commentaries and stuff. I want to share with you another one. This is actually found in a footnote of a study Bible. I'm going to put it up on the screen. I'm probably not going to read most of it, but I want you to be able to see this and maybe read it as I talk about it. For starters, let me explain to you this wonderful source from which this comes from. This comes from a Bible that's called the Net Bible. It's a New English translation, and it has so many footnotes. It's a really thick Bible, and it's got all these footnotes at the bottom. However, you can actually use it at the internet and over the internet at Bible.org or netbible.com. Those are some different websites that you can access the Net Bible with the notes and stuff. And whenever you look at this word that is used, this parable of the wheat and the weeds, I want you to see something about what is actually taking place. Because, we can look at this and we can read this about the weeds and we can think, oh, okay, well, that's a bit of a nuisance. Yeah, but, it's a nuisance. Like, why would the enemy do that? It's just kind of maybe like a mean practical joke type thing is where we might be thinking. However, the Net Bible in this footnote, it actually says that this is a translator's note right here, that word for weeds, it could be also translated that it sowed poisonous weeds is what it is. Now in King James, yes, it's tares. And at the very end of this quotation, it says a number of recent English translations use weeds, but this does not convey the poisonous nature of the darnel or the similarity in appearance to wheat. Basically, they describe that it's this certain type of plant that is sometimes even called false wheat. It's also a poisonous thing that can, kind of harm you if you eat it. And as it starts to grow, it looks a lot like wheat. It's only a certain part of the stage that you start to realize, oh, this isn't the same thing. So in this parable of the wheat and the weeds, the wheat is the good soil, and it's good. The wheat is the good plant, the good seed, and it is sown in there. And then there's something that finds its way in there that has been planted by the evil one. And it looks very similar to it. But it can make you sick. It can cause problems if you end up ingesting that. So this is a very important kind of thing. It's not just a practical joke. It's not just a prank. This is actually kind of a little serious right here. So I believe that whenever we look at this parable, we need to understand this is the evil aspect of it. This is what the enemy is actually doing here. So, like I said before, if you're confused about that parable, so were the disciples. Let's take a look at Jesus' explanation of it. In Matthew chapter 13, verses 36 through 43, we read, "Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, 'Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field.' He answered, 'The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in a fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let them hear.'" So there's so much about this explanation that I think is important for us to gather. And here on this screen, I wanted you to maybe see some of these main things that we're talking about. We're not really talking about a field. We're not really talking about seed and stuff. We're talking about the Son of Man. He's the one who sows this good seed. The field itself is the world, and the seed, it represents people. Whether it's good or whether it's bad, it represents people. That enemy is the ultimate enemy, the devil himself, and the harvest is at the end of the age. And we see that at the end of the age, there's going to be this moment that happens around this time of the harvest as well. In fact, before the harvest actually happens and before the good things are gathered into the barn, those the bad things need to be dealt with because I mean they're even poisonous, and they can cause problems. They can make people sick. And as we look at it here, how many times do we skip over verse 41? Because in verse 41, it speaks about the weeds being the people of the evil one. Okay, that was stated in verse 38. But then here in verse 41, it says the Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. You realize it's not just about the people. Sometimes we look at this and we think of, oh, just, this end time stuff and oh, the bad are going to burn and the good are going to live forever. Well, okay, there's more to it going on right here. And as we see, it's not just all the people who do evil. In fact, it says that he's going to weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. So yes, it is talking about the people who are evil, the people who do evil, and those people who have become corrupted. But yet, it's also everything that causes sin. If we look at our own lives, we can see some things that confuse us. For example, if you're a Christian, is there ever any type of sin, maybe one sin in particular, that just kind of sticks with you, and you might specifically find that hard to overcome? And that is a struggle of yours that you carry on with you. This passage is speaking about a time whenever everything, that sin, and everything that causes it, all of that will be done away. It's not just about separating the people one from another. It's much more than that. It also separates the things within us that are evil, the things that are sown there by the devil, by the evil one. I mean, there's a huge significance in that, and I think that if we overlook that, we're missing something in here. I also think that this parable, and especially this explanation, whenever we look at this a little bit more and notice some of these phrases, like verse 43, it's kind of interesting. He speaks about the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. I mean, it's a nice thought, but it's even more than just a nice thought, because here in verse 43, this righteous shining like the sun, that's actually a parallel between what Matthew is saying right here and the Old Testament prophet of the book of Daniel. Now, it comes to us in Daniel chapter 12 at the very end, and we don't oftentimes focus as much on that part because we know the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel, but the last 6 they read a lot like Revelation, and many times people don't look at those as much. But let's take a look at a couple of these things together as well. So, Daniel chapter 12. This is one of the handfuls of passages that really gives us insight into the resurrection in the future. So in Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 and 3, we read that multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. This passage to Daniel, we're talking several hundred years before Christ ever set foot on this earth. But we see that he is told about how there's going to be a resurrection. Some people are going to rise and it's going to be everlasting life. Other people, it's going to be to shame and it's everlasting contempt. And we see that those who are good, those who are wise, as it states right here, they will shine like the brightness or like the stars forever and ever. It's kind of a beautiful idea. And it's what Jesus is talking about here in verse 43, that the righteous will shine like the sun. That is what is supposed to be what happens to us. That's what God wants to happen to us. Now, this is a clear reference to the prophet Daniel. Are there any other references to Daniel here? Actually, there are. If you look, the verse right before this, in verse 42, there's a phrase that stands out, and it is the blazing furnace. Now, I've actually overlooked this myself until fairly recently, because in verse 42 it says that they will throw them into the blazing furnace where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That blazing furnace, it's actually the same phrase that's used in Daniel chapter 3. You know the story about Daniel's 3 friends. And if you don't, I'm just the summary of it is, Daniel's 3 friends, what happens to them is there is this huge statue that is built by the king. And the king says everybody must bow down and must worship this. And it's this huge dedication celebration and all. And they refuse to bow down because they say, no, we can't bow down because we can only bow down and worship God. God is the only one that we can worship. So in Daniel chapter 3, we see that what the king does to them, the king of Babylon, his name is Nebuchadnezzar, but what he does right here is he's going to throw them into we probably know it as the fiery furnace, well, the blazing furnace. He says they're going to be thrown into the blazing furnace. He gives us another chance. And he says, I'll give you another chance. And this time you need to bow down. They don't do it again. And they actually respond like this. Whenever he again threatens this blazing furnace, they respond in Daniel 3:17 and 18. Beautiful response. And he says, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it. And he will deliver us from your majesty's hands. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So in verse 42 of what Jesus was saying, he says that they will throw them into the blazing furnace. That blazing furnace is not really the place in where they belong. It's not really the place that they should go. And right here, God provides a way to not have to endure that, and he provides deliverance from this blazing furnace. And right here, what he does is he's going to deliver them. Yes, they're thrown. If you don't know the rest of the story, they are thrown into that blazing furnace. But the Lord's he miraculously delivers them. But they had this idea, this belief that, hey, we know that our God, he is able to deliver us. But then they also recognize, look, even if he doesn't in this case, because we don't always know exactly what the Lord is going to do in each and every single situation we find ourselves in. But he says, even if the Lord doesn't deliver us, we want you to know that we're still not going to do this because it's wrong. They still are going to endure this trial. That blazing furnace is not supposed to be our destination. No, God has done so much by sending his son so that blazing furnace does not have to be our destination. I don't really like using images like this and trying to scare people into doing what's right. But I also want us to recognize these images are there for a reason, to kind of teach us and to show us that, look, this is what happens whenever you have these poisonous weeds that come into the field. Okay, well, at the end of time, they're not going to be gathered into the barn. They're going to be dealt with by being thrown into the blazing furnace. But God wants to save us from that. He's given a way to save us from that. And his way for saving us from that is by sending his son, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who actually, the phrase that Jesus likes to call himself is Son of Man. In fact, in this explanation, Jesus refers to the Son of Man. And now I want us to look at the final reference from Daniel that we're going to see, and that is this phrase, Son of Man. All the way back in verse 37, he says, the one who sowed good seed is the Son of Man. Well, that Son of Man is a phrase that, while on the one hand, yes, it just means a human being. On the other hand, it is a phrase that we oftentimes connect with Jesus Christ himself, and rightfully so. And Jesus also quoted, or at least he kind of referenced this passage from Daniel 7. And this is in Matthew's gospel. This is actually the reason, and I might talk specifically about this another time, but this is actually the reason why they decide to crucify him in the first place, is because they believe that he is making himself equal with God, and they believe it to be blasphemy, because he starts talking about the Son of Man coming on the clouds. And whenever he speaks about those images, he's speaking and referencing Daniel 7. And the Jewish leaders, they know it, because Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, Daniel sees this vision. He's already seen God, who here he refers to him as Ancient of Days. So in verses 13 and 14, Daniel says, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like a son of man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He approached the Ancient of Days and was led into his presence. He was given authority, glory, and sovereign power. All nations and peoples of every language worshipped him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. This image right here, this vision that Daniel received, was of one like the Son of Man. It was the Son of Man, Jesus Christ himself, and he is coming with the clouds of heaven. And he approached God the Father, the Ancient of Days, and he was led into his presence. And we also see right here that all these nations, all these people, they worship him. Now, this is confusing for Jewish people because you have this Son of Man, this human being, being worshiped. You don't worship a human being. You worship God alone. I mean, that's one of the big things that you find out in the book of Daniel. But here you find one who is like a Son of Man being worshiped. How does it even work? Well, we understand it in Jesus Christ. He is that Son of Man. He is that Son of Man who came to earth. He is God who became a Son of Man, who became a human being, who came and lived a sinless life. He died on that cross, but we see that he was also exalted. He was exalted so that all the nations and all the peoples of every language worship him. We worship him now. His dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away. His kingdom is one that will never be destroyed. And he constantly shared with us these different images so that we can learn more and more about the kingdom of heaven, so that we will be people of the kingdom of heaven, and so that we will see and experience the great things that Jesus has done for us and that God has planned for us since before the creation of the world. It's up to us as to whether or not we take hold of these things, and if we accept the pathway that God has laid out for us by following his Son, Jesus Christ. That's what we're called to do. Follow Jesus Christ every step of the way into this kingdom of heaven. We can experience these things right here, right now, by having the patience, like what we see in these parables. The patience, like waiting for in that field. The patience, like waiting for that mustard seed, or the patience of waiting for yeast to make its way throughout all of the dough. That is what we are called to do as we follow Jesus Christ.
When such a gift came down to me, when all around was lost, he changed my life, he made me whole, he paid my bitter cost. The last command my Savior gave, just before he had to part. The Great Commission starts in the heart. Though I'm unworthy of his love, he's placed within my hands a treasure of unbounded grace to spread across the lands. The greatest story ever sung, he has asked me to impart. The Great Commission starts in the heart. The love of Christ compels my soul to share so faithfully. Reveal the cleansing of your blood, so matchless, full, and free. Although I cannot teach the world, to reach one will be a start. The Great Commission starts in the heart. The Great Commission starts in the heart.
I will go, I will go, I will go, I will go, I will, I will today. I will today. I will.
The